We're going to be talking today about schools and children and how to deal with them and all of the recent events that are happening, specifically teachers and election fears. We're post-election, but there's some lingering things going on. Our first slide here. Number one, hate crimes. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks these things, they're an anti-hate, anti-bias group, and they monitor all of the activities going around the country, have reported that 701 incidents of hateful harassment have been reported post-election. It's not a lot of days since the election, but there's certainly been a number of hate crime incidents reported. In New York City specifically, hate crimes reported last week were up more than 31% compared to the same week ending last year. So year to year, 31% increase in those reported incidents. Hate crimes specifically reported by the Muslim community have increased some 67% even outside of those numbers. So we're looking at some very specific communities having some very specific problems here. I'm going to take you to the next slide, looking at a post that was put up in a school that was in West Campus High School in Sacramento, California, in response to some of the things that were happening in the broader communities. Wrote, "Dear undocumented student, in this classroom, there are no walls. You belong here. You are loved." It also goes on to, "Dear Black students, dear Muslim students of Middle Eastern descent, Mexican students, female students, LGBTQ students," a love letter to each of those communities, but ultimately says, "Dear all students, we'll get through this day, this year together. We'll respect each other and learn from one another. You are a beloved part of this country and community." So that was one school's response to some of the things that were happening outside of their building and funneling into their school community. And if you have experienced any sort of hate crime or incidents, the Governor Cuomo here in New York has set up a response hotline for hate crimes. And the numbers you can see is 888-392-3644. So if you have been a victim or you know of some incidents, please do feel free to call into that number. But we're going to be talking about teachers and how they're responding to election fears in the A block.
Following the recent presidential election, in addition to the bias incidents Brian just showed us, some communities are feeling vulnerable and fearful about the potential policies of the new administration. While children of those communities may be feeling the same anxiety, their teachers are on the front line helping them navigate the world. But do they speak with their students about the recent election and the potential impact on their lives?
Well, here to tell us about some of the challenges teachers are facing in this politically charged climate are David Bloomfield. He's a professor of educational leadership at Brooklyn College. Welcome back to BK Live, sir.
Nice to see you.
We're also happy to welcome Sarah. Of course, I say Sarah wrong when her last name is Camiscoli, yes?
Yes.
Sarah Camiscoli is the co-founder and co-director of Integrate-NYC-4-me, an advocacy organization focused on increasing diversity in New York City public schools. Thanks for being here.
Yeah,
Thank you both very much for being here. I have a friend from high school who's a principal somewhere here in Brooklyn, and he said the day after the election he had Hispanic children coming up to him and asking him if their families were going to be deported, which is a real concern amongst some of these students. David, let's start with you. How are the teachers you're working with dealing with the fears of so many students?
Well, at some level, teachers are confused. They've gotten advice from the chancellor saying that their discussions should be respectful and they should try to diminish those fears. But there is really no lesson plan at the moment to address this immediate issue. And so their teachers, I think, are trying to be nonpartisan, not identify this as the election result and anti-Trump, but really trying to say, we don't know yet. We will protect you because, first and foremost, that's what students want to know. And they're taking it really one day at a time, one student at a time. That's kind of the usual personal interaction with teachers and students. What teachers should be avoiding is throwing out the curriculum and making every class about raising fears rather than calming fears and business as usual.
So Sarah, we know that schools are just a microcosm of the world, and we've seen like those numbers on hate crimes and incidents that are happening. Are those numbers bearing out in the way that students feel at school? Have there been incidents in New York City schools of these kind of things?
I definitely think there have been incidents in the schools that I've worked in, or I work in currently, where there are a lot of educators and young people committed to equity and committed to integration, and who still are wonderful and powerful and committed despite who might be elected. Right. I haven't necessarily experienced many of those hate crimes. I have heard students say that they're afraid, though. And what I'm really committed to as an educator is supporting young people in moving from being a teenager to being a self-actualized person who brings out their strengths. And so I think what's important now, as David said, is not to allow ourselves to get subsumed by their fears, but instead to say, okay, what's the area of your life you feel like you've lost power in? All right, so you feel disrespected or you're afraid of your family being deported. Okay, who are the people that you can lead or you can be in community with that can support you? And what's a plan that I can help you to create and help you follow up on? In some curriculums, in a social studies curriculum, that might be relevant. In other curriculums like a math or ELA, that may not be, but maybe that's an after-school conversation or group that you create.
I love that idea, though, of putting a name to the fear. Say, what are you specifically afraid or have concerns about, and addressing it systematically instead of making everything like, I feel, like assigning an action to it.
And being responsible for that. I think as someone who identifies as a member of the LGBTQA community, I could say that I'm afraid of certain things, but if I'm spending all of my time in my fear and I'm demonstrating that for young people, I'm saying, don't be clear and don't be action-oriented and don't be responsible for what it means to be civically engaged. Be afraid, and this is how you be afraid. Instead, we have to model for young people how to be active, how to be civically engaged, and how to be leaders right now.
This is such a new frontier, obviously, and startling to so many groups of people across Brooklyn. David, what, if any, policies are in place with the DOE in order to deal with this?
Well, interestingly, the DOE has a policy against partisan engagement by teachers during the campaign. But Trump now arguably is a public official. He's the president-elect.
Well, there's no arguably. He's the president.
Well, you know, president-elect is a little bit different from president.
Yeah.
So in the same way that it would be perfectly legitimate for teachers to praise President Obama, it is legitimate for them to criticize the president-elect. It needs to be done in a respectful way, as the chancellor has advised. But for teachers, when it comes up, they can have the same conversation they would normally have about any political issue. It's important that we not compel students into believing one candidate or another, or whether the president-elect is a good person or a bad person. We should allow the conscience of the individual to be maintained. But it's perfectly appropriate as a political discussion, particularly, as was said in a social studies class, to have robust debate and to focus students on civic engagement regarding their own opinions, whatever it may be. Teachers have been out protesting. At Harvest, they protested at Union Square Park. Students, as you know, have walked out. That's another wrinkle which teachers have to be and principals need to be cautious about. But students can express their own opinions, and that's perfectly legitimate.
So Sarah, in that classroom then, if there are students who happen to be happy that Donald Trump is the president-elect, like managing those things when you personally have a feeling, and there are students who may come to you with fears or you see a divide, what's the key to balancing all of those things there?
Well, I think that it's an opportunity first for educators to rethink what it means to create an environment that's socially just. I think if everyone in your environment believes in the same definition of justice, you're not necessarily doing social justice. And so we have to be able to model for our young people, when someone differs from us, do we get emotionally flustered and do we not know what to say? Or how do we facilitate a dialogue? One really good example that I'd like to give is I had a Muslim student who brought up in class one day, she said, well, if people are illegal, why can't we have them leave? And you know, it stung me for a second to hear her say that because I hadn't heard her speak like that before. And I asked the class, does anyone want to, you know, respond to what she said? And one of our other students who's developed a lot of leadership and civic engagement said, I would request that you use the word undocumented. I'm really offended by the term illegal. No one is illegal. And she said, I don't really agree with that. And I said, can you accept that request for the sake of this conversation? And if something comes up around your faith, we'll make sure that we're using terms that respect you. And she said, I can work with that. I didn't shoot her down. I didn't say I don't agree with her policy, but in terms of creating a space where people don't feel triggered constantly and creating language that people can agree upon, I think is a really great thing to model for them.
And that's a perfectly, it's a perfect example that even though we're in new territory, these are professionals. Teachers are used to dealing with students and controversial subject matter, and so it's good that teachers, it's not like somebody who hasn't been trained.
Right.
Teachers can engage students and are used to engaging students on these sensitive topics by opening up this space for discussion.
What's the point of entry for parents then? Do parents come in and just mess everything up? Because kids spend more time with their teachers than they do with their parents. If we're going to be real about it, Monday through Friday, you guys are the ones who are the touchstone in a lot of ways. So how do parents sort of warp that philosophy of, okay, this is a safe space, or how can they contribute to it even?
Well, I think it's really interesting for us to create code switching opportunities for our young people and to teach them. The conversation I had with my parents over Thanksgiving is very different than the conversation we're having right now.
Right.
And how do we generate for young people that is an authentic way to live and that is a dynamic way to live? And to let young people have the dinner table conversations they'd like to have and have them in the way they'd like to have them, but let them know when you're in an environment where you're engaging with different kinds of people and your opinion is now going to become public or available to the community,
And
how do you want to present
challenged.
yourself? Yeah. And how do you want to set yourself up to be able to powerfully deliver your message so it's received? And again, like I said before, you can carry it out to manifest in the world. I think something we need to be really careful of is what you say doesn't matter, and how you feel doesn't really matter at the end of the day right now. What matters is how you engage with other people and the actions you take to make the changes you want to see in the world. And I think we have to be more integrous and more responsible with how we teach our young people to do that right now.
I think we also have to wait for the children to come to us. Rather than imposing the discussion and sometimes raising the fears, it's a little like sex education. If the students aren't questioning it, leave it alone. When they have a concern in this safe environment, if they're comfortable with their classmates, if they're comfortable with their teacher, they'll ask the questions on their terms, whether it's a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old or an 18-year-old. And all of those conversations are going to be somewhat different. They don't live in a bubble. Let them bring the community discussion, the parent discussion in, and see where they're at. And then the discussion can proceed from there.
I'm wondering what policies moving forward you see maybe put into place depending on how this all evolves over the next 4 years. And since we only have a minute left, I also want you to plug your various organizations if you'd like to.
Sure. So I can do both at the same time. Integrate-NYC-4-me brings together young people from segregated schools to look at the impact of segregation and to create a vision for integration that they can manifest. And one of the policies they're really looking at is relationship building. How can we make sure that every school has at least 2 affinity groups that represent cultural groups on campus? GSAs, Black student unions, Latino caucuses. This is something that's been generated by young people. So I think that that's one thing we can really look at, but 2, also to stay true to what we were standing for a month ago. We may have some emergency situations that we see coming down the pipeline, but what were the policies and the political actions we stood for a month ago, and how can we make sure to stand for them going forward?
And quickly, I teach in the educational leadership program at Brooklyn College. We need great educational leaders, so people should step forward and become principals. I teach ed policy at the CUNY Graduate Center, so people who want a doctorate in this area, welcome. And finally, I am the author of American Public Education Law, 3rd edition, where I have extensive discussion of political speech by students and by teachers.
David, Sarah, thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate the work that you're doing and the great job that you did here on BK Live. Thank you very much.
Thank you.